I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined today by Larry Hancock, a well-known UAP researcher, author, and board member of the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies. Larry brings his formal training in history and cultural anthropology to his research and writing on Cold War history and national security topics. A graduate of the University of New Mexico, he earned his BA with honors, majoring in history, cultural anthropology, and education. Following service in the U.S. Air Force, his career in computer communications and technology marketing allowed him the opportunity to become involved in and consult on strategic analysis and planning studies. Larry's the author of 7 books on topics in national defense and UFO history, and joins us today to discuss Chris Mellon's new revelations about a UFO crash in Kingman, Arizona, and how this relates to Larry's historical expertise in this area. So Larry, welcome back. It is truly a pleasure and an honor to have you with me today, sir.
Great to be back, Tim. Always enjoy it.
Absolutely. And this is right up your alley. So when Chris Mellon launched that announcement on Twitter, I was like, who would know this? I was like, Larry knows it. So there we go. I want to jump right in, if that's okay. On April 22nd, Chris Mellon released chat transcripts from his Signal app on Twitter and his Substack blog from an anonymous source he describes as a senior government official who wrote, quote unquote, "Right now we're dealing with the recovered UAP that landed in Kingman, Arizona in the 50s. So what are your thoughts on this new claim?
My thoughts were, it's like, boy, what a teaser. I mean, there's several thoughts, not even so much about Kingman, but when you look at Chris's whole posting, there are just several elements in that message. I mean, first of all, as far as we know, there was no live, active UAP inquiry going on at that point in time. There had been earlier, those were over. There would not be another for a couple of years. So the first question it's raised is, who would be the person who would have been read into something like this under what conditions? You know, you can sort of understand it happening during an official inquiry, but this is just out of the blue. So, and usually you don't get read in unless you're part of a project and have some need to know. So that's the first thing that jumped out of me. What prompted this access at this point in time? The second thing that jumped out at me is that it implies that there is a whole body of information on crash, retrievals, whatever you will, that has been in existence since at least 1953. And it's been sitting there somewhere. Yet nowhere in all the inquiries, all the investigations, congressional hearings, no one else, as far as we know, has been read into it. The good news is, if this is true, it's still there. It's just that no one has gained access. And it goes back all the way to 1953, and there are some really key things as to why 1953 and February would be important, and that spring would be important, because that was just after the Robertson panel had been convened by the CIA, and after this subject had received interest at the national security level, probably the highest known level that it ever had. So, it's not just the date, the timing, what's in the message are intriguing all by themselves. There are just lots of things that jump out irrespective of Kingman.
There are. I mean, the historical timing of that event is really important, as you mentioned. The other thing is Chris Mellon revealing this, for me, was jaw-dropping when I read that. And the reason has been there are lots of people out there who are speculating and, retelling stories and things along those lines. But Chris Mellon has been different. His approach, his attitude, what he releases, how he releases it. He's been there from the very beginning of the Nimitz story, right? As I understand things, he was the person who released those videos. He got these videos out there. And he has been very careful to protect his credibility and his reputation. So for someone of that stature to suddenly come forward and talk about this, for me, was remarkable. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and he didn't just talk about it. He actually, it's pretty clear from his commentary that he actually got, and this isn't the whole chat. I mean, he's made that clear.
Yeah.
It's not the whole chat. That he actually got clearance to release this, which is kind of mind-boggling because, if if this has been defended by decades and decades that there is no such thing as this historical record, and then suddenly the government, a government agency clears it, you have to go, who's looking across the room saying, who did that? Because someone is going to ask us about this. I really know. And we said we didn't have this, and there it is. So Chris is very good. He doesn't, as with the Nimitz photos, he gets clearance for what he
Yeah.
releases, which is a fascinating aspect of this. And as he speculated in his chat, is this going to cause trouble for someone? I would assume that it would, because it's the other thing that I would assume as part of that signals exchange is that he says that the individual that he's chatting with is an extremely high level government employee, higher level than David Grush, who was actually part of a program. And, that's another aspect of this. He's not identified it, but again, it really raises the question of who and where, to me, would be read into a program like this and for what purpose at that point in time. But yeah,
Yeah.
it's intriguing just on the face of it. I think one final thing to note is that he says that the person, got the whole profile of the program, the history of the program, authorization, the senior officers who were involved, all of that. They let him see all that. Apparently, the whole body of incidents, and he was cleared for all of that. The only thing that he wasn't given access to was anything physical. So, if this is true, he has seen a large amount of information relating to what was collected, and then he was blocked from seeing what was collected. Like, wait a minute. Who drew the line there? Why would you tell this person all this and, then, okay, show it to him and lock him up? But this isn't really the way security works in the government. It doesn't feel like the way security normally works.
Well, let me recap briefly because you did touch on a lot of really important things that are related to this revelation. Chris asserts his source had plausible access and was high-ranking, considerably more so than whistleblower David Grush, and he also has clearance to share from the DOPR. He says he has also shared an unredacted version of this message with members of various congressional oversight committees. Chris Mellon's source also wrote, "We now know the management structure and security control systems and ownership of crash retrieval, who recovers landed or crashed UAP," and he also described the SES-2, who serves as the Air Force gatekeeper, as well as a memo by the Secretary of the Air Force from the 50s that is apparently still in effect to maintain a cover on UAP. So that's all the associated information that came out last week.
One thing I would add to that, which is surprising to me, context-wise, again, this is occurring, if back to the date in 1953, Kingman, right after the Robertson panel is met. Now, the people that initiated the Robertson panel were the CIA. The Air Force had wanted to do it. They didn't have the leverage to make it happen. The president had specifically requested the CIA Technical Intelligence Group look into this. They got it kicked up. The actually director of the CIA got the attention of National Security Council. The National Security Council tasked the IEC, it's an advisory council that they have, to clear this before it actually gets put on as a strategic threat, as a strategic issue. And what would surprise me if it was that high and had been that high, and actually there are new regulations being passed, there are new authorities being given, that it would end up with the Air Force. I would have expected that it wouldn't, with this level of attention that it had just gotten, if a program like this was put in play, it wouldn't remain strictly within privy to the Air Force. I, I can understand the authorities being created by the Air Force, but knowing the history of this sort of thing, I would think the CIA would win, or that it would be kicked up to higher levels. So the fact that his source is saying this has really been covered all this time and operated all this time covertly under the Air Force is a little surprising to me, especially if what was reported being recovered at Kingman was recovered at Kingman. I mean, you're going to need, quite frankly, you're going to need resources that the Air Force doesn't have. You're going to need people that, this is not a Blue Book project anymore. It really is not what
Yeah.
Blue Book does.
Well, let me get into the Kingman, Arizona event. So, researcher Preston Dennett, author of UFOs over Arizona, was quoted by AZ Central as calling this one of the best verified UFO crashes in the United States, which happened on May 21st, 1953, when a cigar-shaped UFO reportedly crashed about 8 miles northeast of Kingman Airport. And the story is that the government sent a team of about 40 scientists to the crash site to investigate that. Are you familiar with this story?
Yes, I'm familiar with the story. This story has actually been in circulation since the early 70s. This is not a new story. I will point
Okay.
out that for whatever purpose, this is not in the Blue Book files. There's no sign that it was ever reported to the Air Force. Uh, the only the only corroboration we have for the story are some local Arizona newspaper reports talking about multiple UAPs being seen flying over Arizona, 8 of them dogfight. Nothing about a crash. So there's nothing corroborative in the history of the time. Uh, the story surfaced actually in a local newspaper in the U.S., local newspaper in the Northeast part of the country, where a couple of young men had interviewed this fellow named Stansel is his name, who provided this
Okay.
story to them. And he gave them a description of the events, the description of the craft. They wrote a little local article about it, and it faded away for another 2 or 3 years until Raymond Fowler, early investigator, picked up on it and actually broke through the pseudonym that was being used, found the fellow, it wasn't that hard, and interviewed him. And one of the things, so at this point in time, we actually have no history per se. We have one purported witness. The witness admitted to Fowler that what he had told the young men was not really the truth. It was exaggerated.
Uh,
He admitted, and Fowler's printed this, that he had been drinking, but then he said, well, but here's the real story. And of course, that always makes us a little nervous. But so the descriptions of the object are different. I mean, the basic thing about a crashed UFO, this fellow, the source, was working uh, basically in Frenchman Flats as a physical engineer, supporting test stands and the atomic testing that was going on with that. And that part, yes, that seems to be clear. He did provide his diary saying that he had been working there at those dates. Unfortunately, he does later on in his story said, oh, he had been contacted by someone at Project Blue Book, essentially called into a Blue Book team, okay, and gives a name. When Fowler contacted that individual and asked him, the individual says, no, never heard of him.
okay.
Uh, over the years, the story hang around because it is truly, I would say, after Roswell, there are two more stories that circulate. One for Aztec, New Mexico, and one for Kingman here in Arizona that talk about fully recovered spacecraft with bodies. And
Yeah.
that's going to keep a story in circulation. That's just the nature of the beast. So, you know, I would have been more pleased if it had been associated with like Kecksburg in Pennsylvania, where we do have absolutely multiple witnesses of a corroborated crash recovery. Not of anything this
Okay.
sensational, but I mean, yes, military people showing up, loading it on a flatbed, towing it. that was clearly that happened. But Kingman, uh, the thing has picked up momentum more recently, and we're talking about really recently in this century. Another fellow claimed to have investigated it himself, found some types of physical evidence. It's a little unclear. And he talks about three UAPs crashing
Yeah.
at pretty much the same time, uh, brought down not by radar beams in some kind of a radar channel. Again, as far as I can tell, I've got books back there talking about the radar installations of the time. No, it kind of reminds me of Aztec in a way, because all the rumors about Aztec said, oh, this UFO was brought down by some brand new, extremely high intensity, uh,
Yeah.
yes, radar. Yeah, so it kind of
Radar.
sounds like
Yeah.
that, but they weren't there for Aztec either. So, okay. Um, but, and there have been, the problem is once you start telling a story like this, other people do show up. Oh, I heard this from this person. I heard this from that person. I have to tell you, Tim, when I was in college, I had a roommate who I knew I was interested in UFOs. He said, oh, my dad worked in southwestern U.S., and he said they recovered the Degnus disc out of the side of a mountain. Like, okay, these stories are not uncommon. I'm not saying there's nothing to them. It's just, unfortunately, you couldn't trace any of this other stuff directly back to corroborate Kingman. So
Okay.
that's the
Okay.
issue.
Well, so I want to jump back to your expertise on this. You recently co-authored a paper on this genre of topic through the SCU entitled UAP Pattern Recognition Study 1945 to 1975 U.S. Military Atomic Warfare Complex. So is Kingman representative of the kind of UFO history of that time? Again, you just mentioned Roswell and Aztec as well. And there was so much going on, but there was also so much cultural fear, I guess, over the Cold War, over nuclear weapons. There was a lot going on, you know.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think the straightforward answer is no. Um, our pattern recognition study absolutely shows there's a direct correlation between some of the best UFO reports and the atomic warfare complex. There is just
Mm.
no doubt about that. That's what's in the pattern study. Then we went on to do an indications analysis of what type of activity seemed to be indicated. Right now, we're doing the same thing in the public space. But no, those reports were very focused and transitioned over a period of years. In other words, they started with the development complex, the radioactive manufacturing sites at Hanford and Oak Ridge, the design and development cell at Los Alamos, and they were clustered there for like 2 or 3 years. And then it moved to the atomic weapons stockpile sites. Okay.
Ah, okay.
And then after that, it moved again to the deployment sites, uh, SAC bases, and particularly to the ICBM sites as they began to go into place. And the interesting thing about the ICBM sites was there would be, when the first generation of ICBMs went in, the Atlases and Titans, there they were, UAP cluster of reports. Then, when those sites were superseded by newer missiles like the Minuteman or the Minuteman III at different locations, the sightings moved. No more. So there's a clear series of transitions. None of that activity resembles what we see at Kingman or Aztec or Roswell for that matter. Uh, these were very focused on where the weapons were being developed, manufactured, and put in place. We're not the place that we don't find them, and perhaps the surprising place that we don't find them, any really solid reports, not that there aren't anecdotal stories, is at the atomic test. Now, you would think, especially because this, like for example, in 53, there was a whole series of tests at Frenchman Flats over several months, probably the largest series in the U.S. And at this point in time, these new directives had been issued by the Joint Chiefs and the Secretary of the Air Force about you got to report UFO sightings. None from Frenchman Flats. None from the atomic
Now,
testing.
so that was the upshot Knoll tests, right?
Correct.
Okay, so and I've got that in my notes. There were 11 nuclear devices tested between March and June 1953 at the Nevada test site, and that's the Frenchman Flats.
Hmm.
George Knapp reported on this for KLS News 8, and he quoted historian Harry Drew. This is where the story about three craft comes up. Harry Drew is a historian who was, I think, restating other stories.
Right.
And then Drew claimed the crash was caused by experimental high-power radar
Right.
sites, which again is something that you touched on a moment ago. So, lots of different stories that have been circulating. But if Upshot Knoll is potentially connected to this, and then Roswell was supposed to be the first nuclear-armed bomber group, right? I mean, doesn't that connect this back to the nuclear stockpile, arsenal, all that?
Well, the interesting thing is that this the Kingman, Arizona example did not occur at the same time as the atomic test. I mean, if you're directly
Mm.
connected, just as with our own observation class, you would they would want to be there, I would think, when the device is being tested. What is there to see after the fact? Roswell is a confusing thing because even though the B-29 silver plate atomic cable bombers were there were no atomic weapons. They actually had to fly to Albuquerque to the stockpile site to pick up the weapons. So, by definition, there's no atomic capability and nothing going on at Roswell per se. It sounds like there is, but there really isn't. Whereas the places where the weapons are, and like where all the Air Force B-29s had to fly to Albuquerque for the the bombs that were dropped in this 53 series that were airdropped, because several of them were tower placed, and some of them were actually artillery shots from atomic cannons. But those aircraft that did the testing were stationed in Albuquerque. That test group was stationed in Albuquerque. They picked up the bombs and dropped them. The interesting place is that if you want to find the true hub of UFO activity during this period of time, it's Albuquerque, New Mexico, because
Ah.
I will say because, but suggestive that is where the atomic weapons test group, air test group, was housed. It's where the weapons are housed. Then later, when actually we built up a stockpile, that stockpile site was up in the mountains outside of Albuquerque in the San Monsanos, actually. So there's some reason to speculate as to why Albuquerque might have been such a nexus for sightings over time. But so it depends on how tightly you use the word atomic. And I don't want to, certainly there are anecdotal stories. It's just that it was surprising to us, considering the emphasis from the federal government, the emphasis from the military on reporting UFOs in exactly this period of time. They're not being reported from the atomic test. Doesn't mean they weren't there, but it's like a striking thing. Um,
Yeah. No, that's intriguing. And it almost sounds like, I mean, again, you're describing Albuquerque as the hub for these sightings. And so you are definitely, reinforcing this nuclear correlation. Lou Elizondo has talked about that. There was the book UFOs and Nukes that talked about that in depth. So that has been there for a long time. But in terms of these stories, um, Roswell, Kingman, and again, Aztec, um, do you think that there's more myth than reality to these? I mean, what do you think the veracity actually plays out to be?
until I see something more. I know people hate this, but I have to play as close to history as I can. And until I see some more corroboration, I've just seen too many stories. It's too easy to see stories. I won't say that there wasn't a crash somewhere, but these particular stories, like I say, if I was going to pick one that was real, that I was really going to chase, it would be Kecksburg. It would be the crash in Newfoundland. Uh, there are places that are much better documented than this. That the interesting thing in those is in Kecksburg we have all kinds of information about a U.S. military recovery team, which is just the sort of thing that seems to be described in
Yeah.
Christmas document.
If it's okay, let me get into that. You emailed me, so I'm going to restate some of your facts, right?
Mm.
Um, you'd said there was a highly secret crash recovery unit that we have documents for. It's a known field intelligence unit established in 1943. It was the 4602 Field Intelligence Unit, established under Air Force Command Chief General Garland in February 64 with 34 officers, 97 airmen stationed at bases across the country, and they had the authority to draw on local aircraft or other resources, right?
This is exactly the kind of unit you would expect. I mean, if there were the history that we were talking about, these would be the people that would have done it. One of the reasons was that after the Robertson panel's report, the Air Force was taking UFO investigation very seriously. I mean, and they had to. In all honesty, they wanted to prove, since they were just addressing the psychological threat aspect and the air defense threat aspect, they wanted to demonstrate it wasn't a threat. And we should be
Yeah.
clear about that. But they actually activated these units, which these were trained units that were used to doing. It had started during World War II, especially later in Korea. They were trained and experienced in going into the field and recovering crashed aircraft, crashed whatever, and bringing them back and exploiting them, exploiting the technology, doing the analysis. So one of the things that confuses me about all of this is we've got a real world known Air Force crash and retrieval unit that was in operation for years. It was in operation for 1953. It had its officers and personnel were stationed all across the United States, not just at Wright-Patterson. And these folks actually were there, and in their charter, their orders, they were there to do this in support of ATIC, and then later, as they were renamed, of air intelligence. So this was a serious resource. It's the sort of thing that would seem to be described in what Chris is writing about, and we even know that they went out in the field X number of times. We also know that later on they went out and recovered satellites. They recovered space junk
Yeah.
internationally.
Well,
So,
if it's okay, let me jump back into what you'd written. I was just kind of scanning through this. So in 1956, they were renamed. They were renamed by the 1006th under the Air Force Intelligence Command, I guess, rather than ATIC. And by 1958, the 7602, which, again, as you just mentioned, they went on to do missions of recovery on satellite and spacecraft crashes under the code names Moondust and Bluefly. And so I think spacecraft crashes in this case, we're probably talking about like, launch boosters and things like that, right? Because again, this was during the Cold War and we had lots of stuff that was being launched into the air and, it was all super top secret.
or re-entering satellites, we have to remember that everybody's photo satellites, ours, the Russians, early on, they weren't transmitting data from orbit. They actually had to drop capsules, and you had to catch them airdropped, and we missed some, we caught some, but you can imagine, like, okay, the Russians are doing the same thing. We want that capsule wherever it comes down. Uh, there were lunar missions that aborted. The Russians uh, launched a number of planetary probes that they put them into orbit, and then you ignite the other stages to go on for escape velocity. They re-enter. So there's a lot of stuff to capture, really. And I
Yeah.
think, but I need to give Kevin Randall did the groundbreaking research in all of this and traced down a lot of FOIA work. Um, the documents are there, and it's another interesting case of ultimately he and other people got the documents that show this had happened. So that's, as I say, one of the things that makes this unclear is we know this was actually going on. So, did some of the crash recoveries get done by this unit and then were compartmentalized? And, did the real,
And
could that have
to
happened?
me,
Yeah.
this brings up this idea also of, if you're an airman, an enlisted person, you're sworn to secrecy, you're trained, they're prepped for this, right? This is something that's a specialization. But it sounds like it's not as if they're recovering an aircraft here, an aircraft there, and oh, look, a UFO. They're recovering all sorts of stuff.
Right.
And so, from the airman's perspective, it's more like someone says, look, we have something coming down here, and this may look a little different. Okay, well, maybe it's a satellite. Maybe it's a Russian booster. Maybe it's one of those capsule containers. And so, you could tell the enlisted people, and you could tell, whoever you're swearing to secrecy in the local town or whatever, you could really tell them all sorts of different things with some kind of a plausible cover story, I guess.
And we have examples of that because they recovered our own stuff as well. Uh, we had a lot of stuff that flew out of Canaveral for testing that was recovered in Central America. Okay, we had stuff recovered in Mexico. Uh, and one great example was a stealth fighter that crashed in
Yeah,
California that we
Nick
recovered.
Cook
And
talked about that.
there are cover stories for all these things. And that's another thing that worries me is, of course, you're going to operate with a cover story. And what's the best cover story? It's something most people won't believe, right? Oh, what did you guys just recover? Oh, well, aliens. Okay, yeah, yeah, we're going to laugh at that. But we actually know, and it's been documented, that there were cover stories put out by the Air Force. Probably the biggest and nastiest cover story was the one that came out of Albuquerque, described in the book Project Beta, that talks about abductions, reptilians, uh, underground bases. They even crashed F-117 played in that one too. And so we really are at the mercy of cover stories. I'm always caught by the fact that we have a document showing that early on, when we were launching stratospheric balloon photo packages to go across Russia out from White Sands, and they were being reported as UFOs. And the CIA guys showed up at White Sands and said, "Yeah, we like this. Keep let them think they're UFOs. This is what we want. We want everybody to think that they're UFOs rather than our balloons." Okay, fine. So we do have to face that. That
Yeah.
this can spring out of that. And the other thing you mentioned is security. Um, one of the things that Kevin did and has written about Kingman also is that the fellow, our primary witness, our only primary witness, says that when they were transported, they got off the bus and somebody did a roll call of all their names. This is not a security thing, okay? And I guarantee you that if that happened, those people would not go away. They would have visitors, they would sign statements. He never discusses anything about that. There's nothing related to his experience in Kingman that makes sense from what I would expect from the kind of extremely tight security that you would have on something like this.
Now, to play the devil's advocate a little bit, in terms of Kingman, the original Mellon statement, let me scroll up here. They used the word landed in Kingman. That's what the official wrote. UAP that landed in Kingman, Arizona in the 50s. He didn't say crashed. He said landed, which to me, when I read that, when I was doing the questions, I thought, that's a little different. I wonder if that means something.
What he says, what the fellow or source says, is that it came in at approximately 1,200 miles per hour. He actually gives that figure, estimates 1,200
Okay.
miles an hour, slid down into the desert, made a groove into the desert, and he actually said that one of his tasks was to calculate the weight of the craft based on the impact it made in the soil. Unfortunately, there's nothing in his engineering background that's a skill, okay. But so
Yeah.
it suggests if you want to consider a landing at 1,200 miles per hour, the point is that it was structurally intact. It wasn't damaged. He describes it being opened up, um, uh, and seen bodies. So yeah, it was undamaged, and I guess from that standpoint, it would be fully recoverable as an operational
Okay.
unit. So maybe that's the reason for the term landed. In truth, the same thing is the same statements used for Aztec. It always fascinated me that it's like, well, how do you get into these things? If they, this advanced technology, this is a spacecraft, let's say, so it's got airlocks and or whatever. Um, well, apparently in Kingman, as far as if you look at the details of his story, like the hatch popped open, and in Aztec, a tree limb knocked out a window. Like, okay, uh, so something happens so that you get into the thing without having to cut it open, which is handy. So again, I don't want. It's just that I would encourage everybody. There is log on and you can find Kevin Randall's analysis of the Kingman, and
Okay.
he goes pro and con. I mean, he does provide. Actually, he even gives well, Fowler did this. We got to remember Raymond Fowler found this and publicized it, so he gives a lot of Fowler's investigation too. But I think what's interesting is you have the first story from the witness and you have the second story from the witness, and you can you can look at the consistencies and the inconsistencies and judge for yourself.
Yeah. Well, so I will put links, and actually, after we finish the interview, please send me over a link to that. I will
Okay.
get that in the show notes on YouTube. I also have links into the SCU. One of the things that I love about the SCU is that they are doing fact based, science based work. It is not simply story retelling, which is so much out there in this community. And I think that comes across loud and clear in what you're saying. You're trying to delineate between what we know and what we have heard that we're not sure about, right? And unfortunately, in this area, there are so many stories circulating. It's difficult to know what's real. And I think that gives a lot of people, myself included, headaches from time to time. So,
Well, and
uh,
the important thing is we do have good data. Sorry to be, but and sometimes the really good data gets ignored for this data.
yeah,
And it's sort of like it gets overwritten. And it's not like, as an example, one of the things that commonly comes up is, can you prove anomalous flight? Well, we have data back from the late 1940s from one of the atomic storage sites where we have instrument assisted readings over a month long period that actually was submitted to Blue Book. And you can calculate the distances and accelerations and flight off of that, and it's truly anomalous. But nobody looks at that. I mean, researchers found it, Blue Book kind of ignored it, but it's not like there's solid data out there. So it kind of, I won't say it's annoying, but it's like, okay, we don't have to have all this other stuff. We could like assess the point with the data that we do have.
yeah. Well, Larry, let me thank you so much for your time today. Again, I'm going to point people towards the SCU at explorescu.org. There is a conference coming up, so if anybody is watching this and they are interested in what's going on there, you are definitely one of the key figures in the SCU. I joined last year myself. It's free to join. It's exciting, and this is absolutely the community to be part of. So I'm going to point people towards that. I plan on going to the conference. I'm going to try and do some interviews and spot footage while I'm there. And again, thank you so much for sharing so much about this story with us. I'm sure that we'll continue to kind of see this evolve as time passes. And so let me close by asking, what is coming up in the short term for you? What are your plans for this
Well, at
summer?
the SCU conference, we actually will be presenting on, we just published a third paper looking at our data set. We looked at patterns in the military space and said, oh, okay, we did an indications analysis. It says our best estimate is this is what they were doing. This is what they were focused on. This is what their activity indicates. Now we're doing the same thing in the public domain. We've published our first
Okay.
pattern analysis in the public domain. We'll be taking our fourth paper into peer review this summer with our conclusions on what their activity indicates for the public. And one of the things that we're seeing is that there is a major transition in UAP activity that begins in the mid 60s. And it's so obvious it's striking. So our direction is to continue this. We will be, after we do this, we'll be doing what's in intelligence circles an estimate of the situation for this whole 30-year period. What were UAPs doing? Is their intent? Now, obviously, this is going out on a limb, right? I might as well, like, where's the end of this branch? I'm out on the limb, but we feel it's supported by the data.
Yeah.
And then our plan is to go ahead and see if we can extend that into this century and see if we see the same patterns. So we're well engaged with the subject, and we're nowhere close to being finished.
Wonderful. Larry, let me thank you again for your time today, sir.
It was a pleasure to be here. Thanks, Tim.